Well, it's pretty common to lend your children money, but what happens if you pass and there's still an outstanding balance? How does that affect the estate, especially when you have other children? We're going to talk about some of these things that can go wrong, some of the confusion it might cause, some of the problems it might cause, but better how to handle these loans within the estate plan and some of the things that Nick kind of works through with his clients when they are in this situation. We'll get started with that next. Welcome in. This is Complete Estate Planning. Glad to have you once again. If you're listening on podcasts, thank you. If you're watching on YouTube, appreciate that as well. Come find us on YouTube if you haven't already. This is a newer venture, but we appreciate the support we've gotten already. So, Nick, what's going on this week? What's happening in the office?
Oh, we're just it's Friday, so we're winding down here. I've had thunderstorms in the morning, but I haven't heard thunder in the last couple hours. So if the weather stays or gets better, we'll be maybe trudging through the mud this afternoon, maybe get out and play a little bit of golf. But we're this weekend I'm going to Dick's Sporting Goods to buy all the supplies ready because baseball starts up next week.
Nice. Last time you're coaching?
Of course. I can't stop. This will be my 7th team that I'm coaching in a row.
Wow.
Well, and here's the deal. So I think I've mentioned this before. The baseball league in our city of Monroe for the youth baseball league is more organized, but way more serious than the soccer league, for good or for bad. And I think baseball, especially youth, is probably like that because it's more of an individualized sport. You know, with soccer, until you get at least, to high school level, if you're not the goalie, it's a bunch of kids running around at the same time. Where I remember for myself when I was young, you wanted to be the pitcher, you wanted to be the catcher, maybe first base, right? And the coach's kids always got to be, the most favorable positions, but we are jumping from T-ball to coach's pitch baseball this year. So
big jump.
That's going to be interesting. They keep score for 6 and 7-year-olds, and they have playoffs that are seeded for 6 and 7-year-olds. And I'm not really thrilled about that, so I'm just going to do my best to say we're going to have fun. We're going to learn baseball fundamentals, and we're not going to be the ones where, they tell stories at the end of the year about that evil team that yelled with the refs they were telling me to check the bats of the other team before the game started to make sure there weren't any illegal bats.
That seems a little absurd.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I'm not doing that. I'm not going to be. So and here's another thing. And I don't remember, it's been a while. But they want us pitching from the rubber and they want us throwing overhand. So, I'm going to be throwing from 40 feet and overhand, and these kids, a lot of them are small, so I'm going to be coming from like 6 feet over their head.
Yeah.
So to speak. So again, I don't know. We'll figure it out, but I don't know. Like and Ben, you're probably over this by now because I've mentioned at the beginning of every season how nervous I am, for problems, and then halfway through, it's like all these kids are a blast. They're having so much fun, and we're smoking everyone. So I don't know. You're probably over it and thinking I'm boy who cried wolf. But my assistant coach actually was head coach last year for his son, and he said I had to take a step back because of the parents arguing with the umps who are usually like 12-year-old kids.
Well, I think more importantly is the name of the team. And I'm assuming because it's much more organized and more official now that you're actually the name of a MLB team rather than the Mozzie Sticks or the Chickaletta.
Well, yeah, so I don't know yet. Now I'll tell you what, I'm going to do what I always do and let the kids try to come to a decision. Color scheme, Hasn't always been a factor, but it's like a forest green this year. So who knows? Maybe that's going to give way to something. We start practice on Tuesday, so we'll figure it out.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I think you got to have a good team name. Everyone remembered the zombies from basketball and feared them, and so we'll figure that out. I have a couple ideas, but the kids need to the kids need to come up with it. So who knows where we're going to go? But I'm already planting that seed. Adam's already got a few ideas, so we will we'll see how that goes. But yeah, we start Tuesday. I'm gonna do my best to make it fun, despite how serious everyone else tries to make it. Now I understand there will come a point where it's not going to be everyone's happy and fun and no one's giving anyone a hard time. Like, I understand that my honeymoon phase will come to an end at some point, but hopefully not, for 6 and 7 year olds. So,
yeah, hopefully not.
Yeah, it's Dick's Sporting Goods is where we're heading this weekend to get everything, and then we'll assess the squad next week, and then I'll let you know. How it turns out.
I love it. Well, stay tuned for updates. Another season of adventure for Nick outside of the office. So we always appreciate those updates. Well, we're speaking of children. That's kind of the topic today, right? I know children is a big part of the estate planning process, but specifically we want to talk about what happens when one of your children owe you money and how do you take that into account. And Nick, for this one, it seems interesting because I feel like there's so many factors that go into this, whether it's, do the other children know? How much is it? Are you going to write it off? There's so many different ways you can kind of take this conversation. So this is, I'm assuming, not a simple process.
No, and I'll tell you what, there's like 5 or 6 things that factor into it, and a lot of it, and we'll kind of break them down individually. But even with all of that, what's right, what's equal, what's fair, and what's going to keep the peace can be 4 different answers. And Ben, a lot of these things we've talked about, the most common answer will reveal itself on its own. Okay, so if you have 3 kids and there's no problems, you're probably leaving the money to the 3 kids. Okay, that's easy. But something like this, there's no set principle or default formula. I've had people all over the place. And so I do my best not to, arm wrestle someone and like kind of push them one way or the other. But it's more of a, hey, here's the 3 or 4 different ways you can look at it. And here's what our options are. What do you think is right? And what do you want to do? And then also, I think, at least personally, we have the discussion on how do you think the kids will react to that when the time comes? Because sometimes you can do the best, most logical, fair, thought-out estate plan, but if it caused the kids to fight and never get together for Easter anymore, what the heck's the point? Right? So yeah, we'll break it down, but I will say I typically go with like a logical-based, kind of options for them, and then we go over the pros and cons, and I still say, but despite all of that, how's that going to play out in real life once you're gone? And is that the way you want this to end? So I've had times where we've had the most logical option, well thought out, and they say, nope, I can't do it.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. So we're going to kind of break this down. We're going to do some pros and cons. How do you kind of treat this? I know kind of to begin this, Nick, what are the goals that you have when somebody comes in with this situation?
There's 2 ways ultimately you can treat it. Okay. You can write it off. You can forgive the debt, and basically turn it into or treat it as a gift. So if there's 3 kids, one of them owes you $100,000, forget about it. When I pass away, we're dividing whatever I have left into 3 pieces, and it doesn't matter. That's one option. And again, there's a number of reasons that that's a good idea. But yeah, you basically forgive it or you convert it to a lifetime gift to where it doesn't matter and we don't need to square up. And And then you have the other option where you basically square it up after someone passes away, which would be, if you don't pay me back when we pass away, you get your inheritance minus that 100,000, so that all three of the kids get total equal shares. And you would be legally, you're treating that as an advancement on their inheritance. So you're basically saying, I already gave you your first 100,000. To square things up and to equalize everything. That's the option. There's only two roads really you can go down here for all of it. Now you'll of course say, well, which one should I do? And I'll break down everything for you. But like I said, it's a personal choice, and a lot of it is doesn't really get down to the logic for the right answer. As far as forgiving the debt, obviously a lot of it can look at the intent. If it was really just trying to help out one of the kids and I was able to do so, and that was just the goal, was to help take care of my kids. Obviously that can help out with resentment or anger, with the child that we lent money to, because otherwise they'll feel like they're getting punished from the grave years later. It simplifies the inheritance at the end, because you don't have to worry about collection or if there's interest or they only paid back some of it. So how much do we owe? It's just whatever's left, give it to them, call it a day. Of course, the downsides, Ben, are very obvious on this too. The other kids could view that as unfair and that their sibling ended up overall getting more inheritance because they got a third of what's left and they got the money on the front end. And they would be correct, because that is exactly what happened. It's not fair. It's not equal. And then it can cause friction, between the kids. And I've seen that happen plenty of times. And I will say this, it can be even worse if the other kids were unaware of it and they find out later and it was like a secret, basically. So I will say that's something you need to be aware of. Now, the other option obviously would be treating it basically as an inheritance advancement. That is the most fair, right? That is the most equal. We're squaring everything up, and so everyone ends up receiving the same amount, even though some of it, someone got while they were alive. And it kind of reinforces that value, if you will. So if it's really important that all the kids are treated fairly and treated equally, that reinforces it. Especially if it was, and I'll tell you this, I've had times where they just gave a gift and didn't worry about it. And then they've had times where, they've come to mom and dad, said, we need money. We will pay you back. And then it just never happens. Okay, so especially if it was the son or daughter said, we will pay you back, and then just don't, then, there's the fairness and accountability there. And it can prevent the other kids from resentment and getting really upset, for they got less money because they were able to take care of themselves and they didn't ask mom and dad for money like the other one did. Obviously, the downside is the child who did receive it. It can feel pretty crummy, like punishment and like embarrassment. At the end, when my dad passes away, if we're sitting around and, they're reading this and it says, all three of us kids get equal shares, but Nick borrowed money from me years ago, never paid it back, so he gets 100,000 less. That can, even if it's accurate, that can make the person who borrowed money feel pretty crummy, right?
Yeah.
Especially if they thought it was a gift. It can create a lot, it can create tension as well if the paperwork and the records are wishy-washy. Okay, so if we don't know how much was lent, or it was a lot of loans, like I lent you some money here, lent you some money here, or what if you paid some of it back, but then just stopped paying or didn't pay all of it? it can be really tough when everyone's arguing over how much I actually still owe and how much my inheritance needs to be deducted. And obviously, that lends itself to, you better have good records. You have to keep good records. If you do not keep good records and you want to square things up, it's really hard to square things up when you don't know how to do it. Okay. But yeah, so those are the two options, like I said, or the two goals, if you will. There's a number of ways to go about it, but those are, and Ben, it's pretty obvious here. I can give an argument for why each of those is a good idea and an argument for why both of those are a really horrible idea, right?
Yeah.
So this is why it's tough, and I give options, but I think it's hard for me to really give guidance or tell people what to do on this. I think this is something I give you the options, but you need to decide which way you want to go with it. And once you tell me how you want it handled, then we can talk about, what our options are, for squaring it up with the estate plan and getting it done.
Gotcha. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I know you kind of mentioned keeping good records. So talk about how you account for this debt in the estate plan. 'Cause I'm sure there's some layers to it, and you got to be pretty detailed on things.
Yeah. Well, first off, you have to have records. You have to have documentation in writing. Couple ways. One, if you do want the loan squared up, okay, you need to have very important documentation on the amount, if you charged interest, what were the repayment terms, how it will be handled after you pass away. If any of the money was partially paid back, you need to have records on what the remaining balance is. Okay, so think of it like, whoever your executor or trustee is going to have to sit down here and figure out how much is still owed, and if they're charging interest, if it was partially paid back, anything like that. So you have to have all of that in writing. You also want your estate plan to reflect your wishes. So if you want the debt forgiven, there needs to be in writing that is what you want. Okay, so you got to be very careful about that. If you want to treat it as an advancement, then you also need to have that as well. So in your estate plan, it needs to appropriately say how that needs to be treated. And if there's going to be an advancement and it's going to be squared up, you need to make darn sure that all the paperwork is there. So whoever your poor executor or trustee is, they can find out the correct amount and square things up appropriately. So another option there, and this is kind of more of a formal option. Some people think this is harsh and don't want to approach the child about it. But you can always do a promissory note. I've had people do that. Like they'll sign up. It's basically like a loan agreement or a contract. It doesn't need to be that crazy. But I've had people put together a promissory note that says, I, Nick Rosenbauer, have lent Adam Rosenbauer $50,000, and it is a loan. It establishes clearly that it's not a gift. And it's a good idea to put repayment terms if it's going to be paid during life. Is there an interest rate? You need to put that. And then also it's a good idea to put in there that when I pass away, his inheritance will repay it. Like you want to put your intent in there in order to take care of that. That is the cleanest way to do it. However, Ben, you obviously understand, like approaching your child about that and having them sign a promissory note. It can be really uncomfortable for people and seem rather harsh. But if you're saying, what is the lawyer saying is the right answer, that's the best way to do this and to document this. But again, a lot of people just aren't willing to do it. Big surprise there, right?
Right.
And then, obviously, in addition to just having kind of the written records on this in general, I would specifically, like what we talked about before about the gets, if the debt's forgiven or what have you, it needs to be not only just like in whatever records you're keeping for the loan, but I would have it in your will or in your trust. And have specific directions in there that says this debt shall be forgiven or this debt shall be specifically repaid from Johnny's inheritance that he's entitled to. And it should include, if interest is supposed to be charged, it should be right in there. And if the loan has been partially paid back or there's a possibility of that, that should be right in there. And then you also want to put in there, and again, this sounds silly, but you need to put in there that there are specific instructions and your trustee is allowed to adjust the shares accordingly to square all of that up. So yeah, obviously you want to keep a written record, but you need to make sure that also not just keep a written record, but it translates into your estate plan specifically.
All right. Yeah. So some things to kind of work through, I guess, before we kind of summarize things, Nick, what path do most people take with this? I'm sure it's kind of all over the board, but is there more one decision that people lean towards over the other?
I'd say on average, people square it up.
Okay.
I'd say on average, and again, it's not like 90-10%, but I would say the majority square things up so that all of the kids receive the appropriate proportional inheritance that they want, as opposed to treating one kid different than the other. Now, usually that is accompanied by letting the child who owes them money know, because surprises after the fact are not good. You don't want that. So if they're going to do that and they say, I don't want one of my kids to get unfair extra money. Also, I think the amount matters. If I just, one time your parents helped you out and, gave you $2,500 because you needed one mortgage payment. Are they keeping score on that 60 years later? Probably not. But if they if they gave you $100,000 as a down payment for your house, and all of the other 7 kids they didn't give any money to, I think that's different. I think the more the amount, the higher the amount, the more likely they are to square it up.
Okay. Makes sense. Well, good to know and good to kind of work through. Again, a lot of communication goes into this. And, this is obviously one of the reasons why you work with an estate planning attorney that can kind of walk you through the decisions, what the pros and cons are, really help you make the best decision that works for you and your family, your children. So if you want to get in touch with Nick, again, CincinnatiEstatePlan.com. All right, Nick, just kind of round it out for us, the kind of the key takeaways here as people kind of think about this moving forward.
Yeah. So obviously, document. Keep the paper trail on everything. It is your choice. You're either going to forgive the debt and write it off, or you're going to treat it as an inheritance advancement, and then we need to square things up. Obviously, they both have good and bad reasons for it, and logic is not always the determining factor here. Okay, so you got to be careful. Even if we're squaring up a $25,000 payment at the end, if that is what causes all the kids to hate each other, is the $25,000 worth blowing up the family? It may not be. So, that's where I really lean on the clients. Like I say, the dynamic of the family better than I do. How's this going to go? But yeah, you want a well-done estate plan that addresses it specifically. You don't want confusion. It's just setting it up clearly with documentation, and having everything buttoned up is going to make things way easier when you pass away. You don't want a scenario where someone passes away and the kids call me and then one of them says, hey, it says equal shares here, but my parents loaned my little brother money 5 or 6 times throughout his life. We can get that back, right? It doesn't say. So I was just hoping you could get it back for us. Like, you don't want that. Okay, so just figure, again, those are the only 2 options. You got to figure out what you're comfortable with and what's going to be the best for the family after you're gone, and then just get it buttoned up. Do not leave it to chance. Don't be silent on it. Don't not account for it at all. So just do your due diligence on the front end. It's going to solve 95% of the problems after you're gone.
Hopefully this helps, but if you have more questions, please reach out. CincinnatiEstatePlan.com. That link is in the description as well, with the phone number 513-463-6789. Well, I appreciate you watching this episode of Complete Estate Planning, or listening wherever you are. We appreciate it. Please subscribe to the show. Nick, we'll talk to you again soon.
Are you feeling overwhelmed by estate planning? The process can seem complex, but it doesn't have to be. The Rosenbauer Law Office is dedicated to helping you protect what matters most: your family, your assets, and your peace of mind. Nick and the team will guide you through every step of the process, making sure you feel confident and informed along the way. Take the first step toward peace of mind today. Schedule an introductory call by clicking the link in the description of today's show.
This show is for informational purposes only and does not provide any legal advice. Information on this show may not constitute the most up-to-date legal information. Please do not act or refrain from acting based solely on anything you hear on this show. This show does not form any attorney-client relationship with the Rosenbauer Law Office, LLC. Please seek the counsel of a qualified attorney before addressing your own estate planning needs.